The carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when Duke Edmund Ashworth heard his friend's warning voice cut through the evening air. "Choose wisely tonight," Reese Calloway said, gripping his arm with an urgency that felt almost like fear. "Your whole future depends on the next few days." Edmund stepped down into the torchlit courtyard of Pemberton Manor, unaware that this single visit would tear his closest friendship apart and change the course of his life forever. Inside the grand hall, three sisters stood waiting to be introduced, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Seraphina Pemberton shone like candlelight given human form, her golden curls catching every eye in the room. Clara stood beside her, sharp-tongued and clever, already amused by the spectacle of suitors lining up. But it was the third sister, standing slightly behind the others, who caught Edmund's attention without even trying. Margaret Pemberton kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded, as though she had learned long ago that rooms like this one were not built for her. Reese leaned close to Edmund's ear the moment they sat for dinner. "There is your bride," he whispered, nodding towards Seraphina. "Marry her and every door in London opens for you." Edmund said nothing, but his gaze kept drifting down the table to where Margaret sat quietly correcting a young lord who had misquoted a line of poetry, expecting no praise and receiving none. Something about her stillness pulled at him harder than Seraphina's brightest smile ever could. When the meal ended and the guests scattered into smaller groups, Edmund noticed Margaret slip away toward the garden alone, as though she preferred the company of night air over crowded rooms. He excused himself and followed, leaving Reese staring after him with growing unease. Under the moonlight, Margaret was startled to find the Duke walking toward her, and she immediately apologized for leaving the gathering early, explaining that she rarely knew what to say to strangers. Edmund told her there was no need to apologize, that he found honest silence far more interesting than empty compliments. For a moment, surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by quiet suspicion, as if she expected this kindness to be some kind of trick. Back inside, Reese watched through the window with a tightening jaw, already sensing that his carefully laid plan was slipping through his fingers. He had spent months arranging this meeting, certain that Seraphina was the only sensible choice for a man in Edmund's position. Little did he know, the quiet sister in the garden had already captured something in his friend that beauty alone could never reach. As the night wore on, Edmund returned to the ballroom with a new request that stunned everyone present. He asked, in front of the entire gathering, to be seated beside Margaret at the next evening's dinner. A ripple of whispers spread through the room instantly, and Reese's expression darkened with disbelief, unaware that this single request had just set an unstoppable chain of events into motion. The next morning, whispers about the Duke's strange request had already spread through every corner of Pemberton Manor. Servants exchanged glances, guests murmured behind fans, and Margaret herself woke to find her mother standing at the foot of her bed, demanding an explanation she did not have. "I did nothing," Margaret insisted, but her mother's sharp eyes narrowed with disbelief. Meanwhile, Edmund faced his own storm. Reese cornered him in the hallway before breakfast, his voice low but furious. "What game are you playing?" he asked, gripping the doorframe. "You cannot throw away everything for a passing curiosity." Edmund refused to answer directly, only saying that he intended to know Margaret better before anyone decided his future for him. Over the following days, Edmund found reasons to seek her out, walking the garden paths at hours when he knew she preferred solitude, joining her in the library where she read old volumes of poetry no one else touched. He discovered she played the piano beautifully, though she only performed when she believed the room was empty. One afternoon, hiding just beyond the doorway, he listened as her fingers moved across the keys with a passion completely opposite to her quiet, guarded manner in public. When the final note faded, he stepped inside and applauded softly, and Margaret nearly dropped the sheet music in shock, her cheeks flushing red with embarrassment rather than pride. Edmund told her she had nothing to be ashamed of, that talent hidden away was still talent, and slowly, carefully, something between them began to shift. She started speaking more freely, revealing a dry sense of humor that surprised him, and a depth of intelligence that made every conversation feel like uncovering a hidden room in a house he thought he already knew. Yet the closer they grew, the more Serafina, encouraged by her mother, doubled her efforts to win Edmund's attention, arranging chance encounters and lavish displays meant to remind him of her charm. Reese used every opportunity to praise her openly in front of Edmund, listing her virtues as though reciting a shopping list of reasons why she was the only logical choice. Edmund grew weary of the pressure, his patience thinning with every pointed comment from his friend. Late one evening, walking near the rose hedges, Edmund overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. Margaret was speaking to her sister Clara in a hushed, resigned tone, admitting that she had long stopped hoping anyone would truly choose her. "No one chooses the sister nobody sees," she said quietly, her voice carrying more sadness than bitterness. Clara tried to comfort her, but Margaret simply shook her head, already retreating back into the careful invisibility she had built around herself for years. Edmund stood frozen behind the hedge, his chest tightening at the pain hidden beneath her calm exterior. In that single moment, whatever hesitation remained in him disappeared completely, replaced by a fierce and sudden certainty about exactly what he wanted, and exactly who he refused to let disappear into the shadows any longer. The following morning, Reese demanded a private meeting, and the two men stood facing each other in the quiet study, tension thick enough to touch. "You are making a mistake," Reese said flatly, listing again everything Serafina offered: her beauty, her family's powerful connections, the approval of society that would follow such a match without question. Edmund listened silently until his friend finished, then spoke with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "I did not come here to find a decoration for my arm," he said. "I came to find a wife, someone whose mind and heart I could actually know." Reese's frustration boiled over, and he accused Edmund of romantic foolishness, warning that the gossip already spreading through the manor would only grow louder and crueler once his intentions became fully known. He reminded Edmund that even Margaret's own family barely championed her, that she had spent years pushed to the background by everyone around her, including the people who should have loved her most. Surely, Reese argued, that silence from her own household proved something was lacking in her. Edmund's temper flared at this, and he told Reese sharply that her family's failure to see her worth was no reflection of her character, but of their own blindness. The argument grew heated, old loyalty straining under the weight of stubborn pride on both sides. Reese accused Edmund of risking everything on a whim, while Edmund accused Reese of caring more about appearances than his actual happiness. Neither man backed down, and for the first time in their long friendship, real distance opened between them, cold and uncomfortable. Reese finally turned to leave, pausing at the door to deliver one last warning. "When the ton mocks you for this choice, do not expect me to defend it," he said, before walking out and leaving Edmund alone with his thoughts. Despite the sting of his friend's words, Edmund felt something settle firmly inside him, a resolve that no amount of pressure could shake. He walked straight from the study to find Margaret in the small sitting room where she often retreated with her books, and without hesitation, he asked if he might call on her properly, openly, in front of her family and anyone else who cared to watch. Margaret stared at him, stunned into silence, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity and finding none. Word of this bold request spread through the manor within hours, reaching every ear from the kitchen staff to the highest-ranking guests, and by evening, Margaret Pemberton, the sister everyone once overlooked, had become the single most talked-about name in the entire county. News of Edmund's open pursuit reached Margaret before she was ready to face it, and instead of joy, a wave of fear settled over her. She convinced herself this attention could not be sincere, that it must be pity, or perhaps some elaborate jest arranged by Reese to humiliate her in front of the entire county. That evening, when Edmund came to find her, she avoided him entirely, slipping out a side door and retreating to her room, locking herself away with only her fear for company. Days passed this way, Edmund seeking her out, Margaret retreating further, convinced that accepting his attention would only end in public embarrassment when he inevitably changed his mind. Her mother, sensing the shift, grew impatient, warning Margaret not to ruin what might be the only real opportunity she would ever receive. But Margaret's fear ran deeper than her mother understood, rooted in years of being overlooked, compared unfavorably to her sisters, and quietly told in 100 small ways that she was simply not enough. Edmund refused to give up. He arranged a private conversation in the Manor's quiet conservatory, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues, and asked Margaret directly to listen just once without assuming the worst. She agreed, arms crossed, expecting empty flattery. Instead, Edmund spoke plainly, describing specific moments he had witnessed, the way she corrected a misquoted poem without seeking credit, the passion in her piano playing when she thought no one listened, the quiet strength in how she carried herself despite years of being pushed aside. These were not generic compliments, but precise, observed truths that no one had ever spoken aloud to her before. Margaret's guarded expression slowly cracked, tears gathering though she fought hard against them. Why not simply choose Serafina, she finally asked, her voice trembling and avoid all this difficulty. Edmund stepped closer and answered without hesitation. Because I am not interested in the woman everyone sees, he said gently. I am interested in the woman I actually know. The words hung in the quiet room, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of his honesty settling between them like something solid and real. Margaret searched his eyes for any trace of deception and found only steady sincerity staring back at her. Something inside her, long guarded and carefully protected, began to loosen for the first time in years. She did not accept him completely that night, still cautious after so long spent believing herself unworthy of such attention. But as she walked back to her room alone, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future standing beside him, unafraid and finally seen. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was the first she had allowed herself in a very long time, and it refused to fade quietly away no matter how hard she tried to push it back into the shadows where she had always kept it hidden. The final ball of the season arrived, and Pemberton Manor glowed with candlelight, music, and the nervous excitement of 100 whispered predictions. Every guest expected the same outcome, that Duke Edmund Ashworth would finally step forward and claim Serafina Pemberton as his bride, ending weeks of scandalous speculation. Instead, when the orchestra began the opening dance, Edmund crossed the crowded floor and extended his hand not to Serafina, but to Margaret, who stood near the edge of the room in a simple gown, startled by his sudden approach. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, and together they moved onto the floor as the first dance of the evening. Whispers erupted instantly, fans snapping open to hide scandalized expressions, but Edmund kept his eyes fixed only on Margaret, guiding her with quiet confidence as though no one else in the room existed. Rhys stood frozen near the refreshment table, watching the scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning understanding. For the first time, he truly saw what Edmund had seen all along, the graceful confidence blooming in Margaret now that someone finally looked at her and refused to look away. When the dance ended, Edmund led Margaret out to the moonlit garden, away from curious eyes and endless chatter. There, beneath the same stars that had witnessed their very first conversation weeks earlier, he knelt and asked her to marry him, explaining that he wanted a wife chosen by his own heart and judgment, not by the shallow standards society insisted upon. Margaret, tears slipping freely down her cheeks, accepted without hesitation, her voice steady despite years of doubt finally giving way to certainty. Back inside, Rhys approached Edmund quietly once the couple returned, his earlier pride replaced by genuine humility. I mistook attention for worth, he admitted, extending his hand in apology. I am sorry for doubting you and sorrier still for doubting her. Edmund accepted the apology without hesitation, grateful to see his oldest friendship mend itself even as his future opened wide before him. News of the engagement spread through the county within days, and though some continued to whisper about the unconventional choice, most who witnessed Margaret's transformation understood exactly what Edmund had recognized from that very first night in the garden. She was never truly overlooked, only waiting for someone patient enough to look closely and see her clearly. As the wedding preparations began, Margaret Pemberton walked through Pemberton Manor with a new confidence in her step, no longer the quiet sister hidden in every family portrait, but a woman finally standing exactly where she belonged, beside a man who had chosen her not despite being unseen, but because of everything he had discovered once he finally looked.